Imagine Europe centuries ago covered in these like massive forests, right? Forests just stretching out forever and just think of those ancient gatherings, maybe some rituals happening, we don't really know.
Yeah.
Um Today we're going to dive deep into that world, right? The world of the Celts, all this material you sent over. I can't wait.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they hear Celts, they think warriors, right? Like a
Yeah.
fierce warriors, maybe with some cool body paint. And of course, the Druids right in those misty groves. But we're going to try to look past that stuff today, really dig into the Celts as like a full-blown civilization and how much they impacted Europe. I mean, their culture, their languages, even how societies are set up. We're going to see it all.
Yeah. So we're talking about a huge chunk of time here, right? Not just like a blink and you miss it kind of thing. What's the time frame we should have in mind?
Yeah, we're looking at roughly 1200 BCE to about 500 CE.
Yeah.
So quite a long period. And during that time, you had all these different Celtic tribes spread out over, I mean, a massive area. We're talking Ireland, Scotland, Wales, obviously, but then also France, even further into Europe.
So not like a big Celtic empire or anything, more like a bunch of related groups. Is that what I'm getting from all this?
Exactly. They weren't one big political unit like the Romans later on. It was more like a network of tribes, each with their own leaders, their own territories. But the thing that tied them together was language, right? They came from the same linguistic root. And they had a lot of shared cultural stuff.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking, similar traditions when it comes to art, religion, things like that.
Which brings us to that art, man. It's incredible, right? Have you seen some of this stuff? The
Yeah.
knotwork, the metalwork, it's just mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah. When you look at the La Tène period specifically, that's around the 5th to 1st centuries BCE, you see this incredibly distinctive style. Their jewelry, their weapons, even everyday objects, they were all decorated with these really elaborate flowing designs, spirals, animal figures. They had that classic knotwork that just seems to go on forever.
And it's more than just decoration, right? I mean, what can these artifacts actually tell us about the Celts themselves based on everything you've read?
Well, they show off their amazing artistic skills, that's for sure. But they also tell us a lot about their warrior culture and their beliefs. The amount of effort that went into making even weapons suggests that warfare was like a sacred thing for them. And warriors held a really high status in their society. And then there are all those recurring symbols and motifs. They must have had some deep spiritual or cultural meaning. It's fascinating.
Like that Triskel thing, right? The 3 spirals. What
Yeah.
have you read about that one?
Oh, yeah. Some people think it represents the 3 realms like earth, sea, and sky, or maybe the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. It's the kind of thing that makes you think.
Makes you wonder if those artistic styles had a lasting impact. Did they influence later European art? Kind of feels like, when I look at that Celtic knotwork, it reminds me of the stuff you see in those medieval illuminated manuscripts.
Yeah.
It's definitely possible. I mean, tracing those lines of influence over such long periods is tricky, but it wouldn't be surprising if the Celts had a hand in shaping the overall artistic landscape of Europe. That love of intricate detail and flowing lines could have easily resonated across cultures and time periods. It's not a direct one-to-one, but you see similar detail in later insular art, the Book of Kells, for example, even if it's a few centuries later. It's suggestive.
So let's talk about how these Celtic societies actually worked. We know they weren't one big nation, so how did they govern themselves based on your research?
It was mostly tribal leadership. The power was usually in the hands of a chieftain and a class of nobles. Very different from the centralized governments in places like Rome or Greece. Power was much more local, tied to family connections and loyalty to a particular leader or tribe. You might have read about some of those powerful chieftains who commanded a lot of respect within their own tribal lands.
And of course, we can't talk about the Celts without talking about the Druids, right? They pop up everywhere, even if they are a bit mysterious.
Yeah, they were like a central pillar of Celtic society. They weren't just priests in the religious sense. They were also judges, teachers, scholars, advisors to the chieftains. Basically, the intellectual and spiritual elite.
And it's amazing how much of what we know about them and about Celtic culture in general comes from oral tradition, right? They didn't leave behind tons of written records like the Romans did.
Yeah, that's really important to understand. Oral tradition was everything for them. Bards and poets were incredibly important because they were the ones who kept history alive. They memorized and recited all the myths, the laws, the customs. Everything was passed down through generations, through songs, stories, recitations. It's amazing when you think about it.
It really is. It makes you appreciate the power of memory and storytelling, right?
Uh-huh.
How else could a society preserve its history, its values, its entire cultural identity over centuries without writing it all down? It's just fascinating.
Definitely. It shows you a totally different way of keeping knowledge alive, one that relied so much on community participation, on rituals and repetition, and the power of the spoken word.
Okay, so We've talked about their art, their social structure. What about their everyday lives, their beliefs? How did they see the world around them?
Well, nature was incredibly important to them. They had a very deep spiritual connection to the natural world. They worshipped all sorts of deities who were often connected to specific places, elements like fire or water or natural forces. And their mythology is just incredible, full of these amazing stories about gods and goddesses, mythical creatures, heroes. There's not one single unified Celtic pantheon like the Greeks or Romans, but you see recurring themes and figures across different Celtic regions, which suggests that there were shared beliefs. And there's archaeological evidence, too, votive offerings found at springs and groves, things like that. It shows how important the natural world and the spiritual world were to them.
It sounds like a much more complex society than just a bunch of warriors running around. There was a lot of depth to their culture and worldview, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Warfare was a part of their lives, of course, just like in many ancient societies. But it's not the whole story. They had complex social hierarchies, legal systems based on tradition, and a vibrant artistic and spiritual culture that deserves way more attention.
And then there's Julius Caesar, right? He kind of looms over our understanding of the Celts, even if he wasn't exactly unbiased.
Yeah, Caesar's Gallic Wars, which happened in the 1st century BCE, give us one of the most detailed accounts of the Celtic tribes who lived in Gaul. That's what we call France today. Of course, it's written from a Roman perspective, but it still gives us valuable information about their customs, their society, their interactions with the Romans who were expanding their territory rapidly.
But it's crucial to remember that Caesar had an agenda, right? He wasn't some objective observer.
Exactly. He wanted to conquer Gaul, and he wanted to justify his military campaigns. So when he describes the Celts, he often does it in a way that makes them look like worthy opponents, which makes him look good. But he also often portrays them as kind of barbaric, which makes his conquests seem more necessary, like he's bringing civilization to these people. So his writing is valuable as a historical source, but you always have to read it critically and remember his biases.
Still, even with those biases, Caesar's campaigns were a huge turning point for the Celts in mainland Europe, weren't they?
They were. The Gallic Wars basically marked the beginning of the end for Celtic independence in much of mainland Europe. The Roman conquest had a massive impact on their societies, leading to assimilation and the eventual loss of their political power. It was a clash of cultures that changed the map of Europe forever.
And now for something completely different that actually ties back to the Celts' Halloween. I have to admit, I was pretty amazed to learn about the Celtic origins of this modern holiday.
Yeah, it's an interesting connection. Halloween comes straight from the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain, which they celebrated around the end of October, beginning of November. For the Celts, this was a time of transition from the abundance of summer to the harsher winter. It was seen as a liminal time when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was at its weakest.
So all that spooky stuff about Halloween, the ghosts and spirits that comes from these ancient beliefs.
Exactly. They believed that at Samhain, spirits could cross over into the world of the living more easily. That led to all sorts of customs and rituals, some to ward off evil spirits, others to honor the dead, or even try to communicate with them.
It's amazing to think that a holiday we associate with candy and costumes has its roots in such ancient and powerful beliefs. It really makes you think.
It does. It shows how elements of ancient cultures can survive and evolve, and sometimes pop up in surprising ways in our modern world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of the Celts, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
I think the main takeaway is that we need to move beyond those simple stereotypes. The Celts weren't just warriors or druids hiding out in the woods. They were a diverse group of people with a rich culture, a sophisticated artistic tradition, complex social structures, and a deep connection to nature.
And even though they didn't leave behind a ton of written records, their influence on Europe was huge and lasting, right?
Absolutely. Their art might have influenced later, European art. Their languages still have an impact today, and even some of our modern traditions like Halloween come from them. They left a mark on European history and culture, that's for sure.
So here's something to think about now that we're done with our deep dive. Think about how elements of ancient cultures, maybe even one as seemingly far removed as the Celts, might still be influencing us today in subtle ways. Maybe it's a design you see, a word you use, a tradition you follow. See if you can spot those connections. You might be surprised at what you find and how much the past is still present in our lives.
It gives you a new appreciation for how long and how interconnected human history really is.
Well, thanks for joining me for this deep dive. Until next time, keep it